friends. Thanks for taking time to listen in on a conversation Dick and I had about the 2024 Bahrain Grand Prix. First race of the year. Okay, not a shocker, Max and Red Bull raced away with P1. Despite that, we actually had a lot to talk about. This race felt like part 2 of 2023, like nothing had changed. Ferrari is indeed closer to Red Bull than previously thought. And oh, how some teams have gotten it wrong. Looking at you, Alpine. Surprise bonus, John's notes from the race. He wasn't able to join the recording session, but still wanted to contribute. Hope you enjoy our conversation. Bahrain Grand Prix has concluded, and we have commenced with the 2024 season, the most races in a given year for F1. Dick, let's review this race.
Let's do it.
This was the same track that we did testing at. I do want to highlight quali just for a second, and specifically, I was so pleased by Nico Hülkenberg's quali performance.
Yeah, you know what? I was really pleased to see him qualify as well as he did. A little surprised that Magnussen was actually kind of left in the dust by Nico, although that was probably one of the more minor storylines, I think, from last year. But I think even maybe the bigger news is that they seem to be getting their arms around the tire deg problem that they had last year, because we saw this last year in that the Haas's could be fast at some tracks, but then they would just fade away in the race. And the reason is because they were just so hard on their tires, and they seem to be getting their arms around that. So, fingers crossed. I'd like to see those guys pull themselves back up to the field. It's certainly a good start for them.
I agree. I think that as I'm looking at Komatsu's leadership and trying to think about where like his personality profile or leadership or expertise, whatever words you want to attribute to him, it seems like he's going to lean heavily on his technical experience,
right,
and training, which seems like a very good decision on the part of Haas to put him in that seat, since that seems to be the place where they have been struggling, and who knows how long he's there, what the goals are, all that. But I think that what you noted of the change from testing weekend to this shows that the data, they really went back and looked at data to figure out how can they adjust. And then Nico, I just couldn't believe it. I was sitting there going, wait, what? You're getting into Q2? You're getting into Q1? Come on now, that's great. So I felt very happy, especially as an American team. I thought, good for them. Anybody else that was something that you enjoyed from quali?
Well, I don't know so much about enjoying it, but I was a little bit surprised by McLaren. They just were not as quick as I thought that they would be in qualifying. I thought that they would be further up. Yeah, they were in Q3. Okay. But it was sort of towards the back end of Q3. And, and Lando Norris said, well, this is really not our track and all that kind of stuff, which, okay, fair enough. But if you're going to win a world championship, you got to be good everywhere. You can't be good at just half the tracks, because if you hadn't noticed by now, the Red Bull's good everywhere. So, you got to get to that level, right? And so I was a little disappointed because I like McLaren. I like their drivers, like Zach Brown. But, they clearly are not there yet. But I would also be really interested to see how they do at Jeddah, because that's a fast track and that should suit the McLaren better. So let's see what happens.
I love that line that you said. If you're going to be world champion, you got to be good everywhere. That's such a quotable quote. Okay,
even a blind squirrel finds a nut every once in a while, Sabrina.
That's great. Okay, so then let's look at the Grand Prix itself. I know for me, when we asked the question, who caught your eye, driver, team, it wasn't a shocker, I think, that it was Red Bull and that RB20. It's got race pace.
Oh, yeah.
That was probably the slight question we had, right? That did it have pace after testing? But then it had pace. Like, it had pace. And for, I think it was Toto Wolff who had said, it's in another galaxy. When I heard that, I went, yep, that's the truth. But then the question, I think, becomes the one that I've already resigned myself to. But when I watch people or I listen to people or I watch people on the social media talking, they seem kind of surprised that that's the reality we're in, which is Red Bull is doing so well and Max is doing so well. I'm like, why don't you reconcile yourself that that is reality and let's look elsewhere for the beauty of what this sport brings to us and
Mhm.
watch everyone aggressively, hopefully, try to close that gap.
I guess a couple of things. This is, as far as I'm concerned, right now, it looks like 2024 is just going to be deja vu all over again, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
it's really one of those things where you say, okay, if I look at the qualifying times, the Red Bull is a little bit quicker, 2 or 3 tenths maybe, but that's it. Okay. But then you get to race pace and it's like what we saw last year. You green flag, right? Green lights, off we go. Charles challenges Max for the first few corners. Max finally pulls ahead a little bit, and then he puts his head down, pulls together a handful of like really, really top laps that pull him away from the Ferrari because his race pace is better. And then he sits there and cruises and collects for the rest of the race. And oh, by the
Mm-hmm.
way, even though Max is driving at a real relaxed rate and all this kind of stuff, he is consistently going faster than anybody else because the car is doing what it needs to do on the tires. I don't know if you noticed, but I mean, he pitted 5 laps after everybody else on
Mm-hmm.
softs. So
Mm-hmm.
he not only was he fast, but he was easy on the tires.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought it was really interesting. One of the things, and I don't know how this matches up with Red Bull, but in I guess it was free practice 2, they were showing Lewis out running, basically testing his race pace, on soft tires and full fuel loads or heavier fuel loads anyway. He was 7 seconds slower in that mode than he was when he was out doing a qualifying sim. Think about that, 7 seconds. So what does that
Wow.
mean for the Mercedes versus the Red Bull? I mean, you could be 5 seconds off your qualifying pace, and you're still blowing everybody into the weeds, race pace wise. So, I think that's the real question is that, we saw this kind of with Aston Martin. I mean, they're there or thereabouts on one lap race pace, both for Alonso and Stroll. Stroll did a good job in qualifying. He just missed Q3. But then the lights went out and Aston Martin just went backwards.
Mm-hmm.
Now
Mm-hmm.
Lance got nailed in the first corner, but that's another story. He actually had
Mm-hmm.
a good recovery drive.
Yeah, I do think that this is really the question of one lap pace versus race pace.
Yep.
And that even when I look at Ferrari, I was intrigued to see out of all the teams whether or not they could put a little bit of pressure on Red Bull. It
Mm-hmm.
seems like that if it was just on that one lap qualifying, that's where Ferrari could sneak in and at least take those poles and then try to fend off. But even when you say like this is deja vu, I was thinking about that. I was like, well, the few times that they managed to even just get out of the grid right as the lights went out, they could only sustain it for so many
Right.
races before either A, the car didn't quite, you know, be able to, or more often than not, it was the sheer max ability to just get in there, overtake and go. And then
Yeah.
once he's gone, he's gone. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's done. You just kind of resign yourself to all right. Well, that was nice effort, you know.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of like wasn't it Monza? I feel like it was Monza this year that was what happened. Like everybody was so excited to see Carlos leading for so long and then, it was the inevitable. But
Yeah.
here's where I feel like okay, they did show us that they do have race pace, I think, if you remove Max from the equation and then going back to the whole quali part. I'm
Mm-hmm.
thinking that if they can fend off what I see as perfection from Red Bull and somehow they can up their game. I've been struggling because I've been trying to think about how to articulate this. It would require Ferrari to really get to that level of perfection that is the level that Red Bull has. I don't know how they can get there. I don't know if they've gotten there, if they can even do that, but I think that if there's a hope for them to challenge Red Bull, that's what needs to happen because I feel like the car is probably close again, if you remove Max
Yep.
out of the equation,
Well, and
it
I
would
think, yeah, I think Ferrari can challenge Max, quite frankly.
really.
Yeah, not all the time, but I think that there will be times this year where they're going to be pretty close, and they might actually put pressure on Red Bull. Um, and I've said this before, just kind of musing out loud on one of our podcasts. That it's just sort of like Red Bull has had it their way for so long. You realize that Max has been leading the World Driving Championship since May of 2022.
Mm.
He's been atop of the list for that long. I don't know if Red Bull as an organization really remembers how to deal with like really intense pressure being thrown at them. And it'll be interesting because it's very possible they could have complacency setting in.
Yeah. Well, and then if there is a hunger in Ferrari and
Mm-hmm.
there's good leadership, like it's going to
Yep.
require everyone to pull and work together at every race, at every moment. I think
Yep.
considering the internal dynamics at Ferrari, I do wonder, like Carlos, he's on his way out. He knows this. Can they get him to remain
Right.
collaborative and
Right.
not see himself as I've got to think about 2025, right? And it's if I can win here in Ferrari, great. But like it's that mental question that you have when you know you're out the
Mm-hmm.
door in a job, right? Like especially if your employer has created the disengagement and
Right.
you technically have to still keep working, but then you know that your reputation, and I think there's like double sides to that, right? He needs to make sure that he appears as strong of a contender for any seat in what's going to be like I was looking at a graphic that showed the volume of open seats next year. And so he's
Mm-hmm.
got to really put himself out there. So it's going to be a delicate dance. I think he's going to have to do of where he shows his value as a driver to external forces while internally playing to the team strategy
Yep.
without, harming the team because that would ruin your value outside. I
Oh
think
yeah.
the other thing is what we've seen in past years, right? Like the pit stops and the strategy calls. It seems like that towards the end of the year it was getting better. And I
Right.
want to believe that maybe they can improve to the point that they can start to challenge Red Bull at some point. What do you think about what I've just said?
I think you're 100% correct. And I certainly think that the fingerprint of Fred Vasseur
Mhm.
as team principal at Ferrari, it's starting to pay off. It's been slow,
Mhm.
but it could very well be, big ship, small rudder. And it's going to take time to get that ship pointed in the right direction. Not that they were that far off the mark anyway, but they definitely needed to reevaluate how they did things and strategy and pit stops and all that you want to call it basic blocking and tackling. I'm not sure that that's exactly what you'd call it, but let's call it for that for now. You got to get that's the kind of stuff that's almost like free. I mean, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Good pit stops are good pit stops. Whether you're driving a Haas or a Red Bull, everybody can do a good pit stop.
Right, right. Well, and so like the other thing I wanted to ask you is I didn't get to look at the data and don't really quite know how things ended up. But in this specific way is
Mm-hmm.
that the top of the pack, the proximity to Red Bull, specifically to Sergio.
Mm-hmm.
If you remove Max from the equation, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is how I've been thinking. If Sergio is somehow gotten a handle on the car during winter break, then I think that's who everyone needs to be targeting their focus on. Because, like you said, he is uniquely situated. He and that car, Red Bull 19 or 20, whatever, were like made for each other. But if
Right.
you can pick off Sergio, then maybe you can strategically accumulate those necessary points. Because I was looking at the fact that if you remove Max from the results of Bahrain, and this is my humble opinion, right? The gap in all of this that I'm talking about that is achievable. But if you look at Max and his points, you take that off the deck.
Mm-hmm.
Carlos and Charles actually got 27 points combined, while Max got 26. So if you're looking at it for constructors' perspective. So,
Ah,
and
yeah.
Sergio got 18. So if your goal as a team is to try to get P2 and P3 in every race, you could very easily start to accumulate the points necessary to get constructors. And
Yeah,
I just wonder if that's what some of these teams might be thinking after watching this race, like thinking we could be in a better
right.
position financially. And if we can convince our drivers, yes, of course, we want you to get P1. But when it comes to strategy calls and decisions, we're trying to be realistic and trying to get as many podiums and in the process develop ourselves to perfection so we can actually get to the top step. What do you think? Could that be
Yeah,
where teams are
and
looking?
it's sort of like just concede the race is Max's.
Mm-hmm.
So now let's take second and third and do everything we can to push Sergio as far down the field as you can.
Mm-hmm.
And he's going to score his points. And oh, by the way, yes, he had a small mistake in qualifying that penalized him and gave him a much lower grid position. But he was only 2 or 3 tenths off the pace.
Mm-hmm.
And he drove very, very well, came through, did exactly what he needed to do, bagged a second place. So, it's going to be no small task to push him off the podium, I think.
So the gap, you're saying the gap from P3 and onward, or the top of the pack, I should say, P3 onwards, they were fairly close to
Yep.
Sergio, or were
Yep.
they?
I think
Okay,
so.
okay, okay. I did not get to look at that data. So, and I just assumed that there might be some area of a gap because I think that performance gap, and even Carlos made it seem like that. I was reading an article and he said, I think we were at one of the strongest tracks of the season with very high tire deg. And he said, hopefully we can go to a more front limited track and maybe more tarmac, and our car will come alive and we'll be able to mount a better challenge on Max for the win. And when I read that, I thought, well, what if it's just you go after Sergio? And then
Mm-hmm.
you can start to build in, because the other part of I kept thinking was everybody's developing. Like you have to continue and start thinking of where they're going to only get those incremental development that they are expecting to get. And clearly
Yeah,
they know how to do.
and the thing that it shocked me, I don't know if you saw it, but apparently there's a big upgrade package coming to the RB20. So
Seriously?
that's what I heard. I mean, I was like, when I read it, I was kind of like what you just said. Seriously? But yeah, they're not rusting.
Oh, wow. I had not read
Mm-hmm.
that. Golly, I
Yep.
can't imagine what else you're going to be able to upgrade.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we were kind of that way. What do you do with the RB19? Well,
That's
they came
true.
out with a 20 and look at it.
I thought one of the teams that surprised me, and I consider now a little bit of a sleeper, not necessarily for P2, but for the middle of the pack, was actually Sauber.
Yeah.
They really surprised me in their performance, especially with Joe getting up there into the level that he did. And then I just feel like it was unfortunate for Valtteri, the
Yeah.
whole pit stop. I think that if that had not happened, we would have seen him, because that guy knows how to drive a car too.
Yeah,
I
he
feel like
does.
that's a line I've gotten from you and from John.
Well, I think Sauber definitely took a step forward. And with them eventually becoming the Audi team and all that kind of stuff, you always have to wonder, just how motivated are they, to ride the season out. We kind of wondered about that last year when it was the last year with as being known as Alfa Romeo, blah, blah, blah. And Audi is buying more and more up of Sauber as time goes on. So I kind of wonder about that. But all that said, they did look pretty good, didn't they?
They're not contending for P2.
No, no.
If we're realistically putting them where they seem to be now and thinking that this can set them up for future success, I think the team will be able to regroup and contend well for this season. I
Oh
really
yeah.
do. I felt
Yeah,
like,
and I think you might think of them as on a par with what Sauber was, and with Alpine, where they were
mhm,
at last year.
well, and hopefully they don't follow the path of Alpine this
Oh
year.
my gosh, yeah. Well, we can talk about that in a minute.
Let me ask you this question. What, if any, thoughts do you have about tires and tire strategy that we saw during the race overall?
Well, of course, they were running the hards for the duration of the race, and they started on the softs because that's what they qualified on, but then they had to go to the hards. And honestly, I saw a couple of shots where the cars, it was like an overhead shot of one of the Ferraris, actually. And it was before the race, it was on the front straightaway. And I was really shocked at how many pieces of rock you could see in the tarmac that the car was sitting on. I mean, it was almost like one of those PebbleTech driveways.
Mm.
And I was just sort of like, holy smokes, it's no wonder this track is high deg. I mean, it was like looking at sandpaper, except that the rough parts were really big. So, yeah, kind of amazing. So, yeah, they didn't really have much choice. They had to go to the hard tire.
Seems so odd to have that, and especially so
Absolutely.
early in the season, like when
Yeah.
the cars are just trying to figure out, the teams are trying to figure out their cars, to have such a high deg in that
Yep.
way. What do you say about any of the data?
Yeah, well, I mean, let's go with the obvious one first, the 800-pound gorilla in the room, right? Which is Red Bull's not going anywhere. Max is still driving supremely well. And those, the combination of Max and Red Bull are the class of the field. I think the gap is closer, at least for qualifying. But if you look at the racing that was down the field, there was actually some really good racing. Guys were pulling off passes. Some of the passes were pretty, gutsy moves, so to speak, that if both drivers didn't play it like pros, it was going to come to tears. So that's always fun to watch that kind of racing. I kind of like it a little bit on the side of lunacy. It does make me wonder, with Max and Red Bull dominating again like this, you've got so many new people who have become interested in F1 because of Drive to Survive. How long are they going to stick with it when the racing becomes so predictable at the very front of the field? I really, really wonder about that.
Mhm.
You can't throw an extra 20 kilograms on just Max's Red Bull, right? This is a meritocracy. And so the other guys have got to build a faster car. And
Mhm.
the teams have to perform, the drivers have to perform, blah, 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 all that
Yeah.
stuff. But so as somebody who's an experienced fan and knows something about the sport and has driven themselves and managed a team and all those kinds of things, I can tell you, we seem to be in a point in time when one team and one driver goes and dominates for multiple years. And we've seen this since the turn of the new century. It started with Michael Schumacher. It then went to a period of 3 years where we had, Kimi winning a world championship, and then Lewis won a world championship, and then Jensen won a world championship, and then all of a sudden here comes Sebastian Vettel in the Red Bull, and he runs the tables for 4 years. And then Mercedes shows up, and they ran the tables for what, 7 years, something like that. And with Lewis doing most of the winning. And then now we're in a new era where it's Max and Red Bull. And once again, so, really, it's a very rare thing that you see different drivers in different cars win over the course of 2 or 3 seasons in a row. It seems to be, for whatever reason, at the turn of the century, we've got this situation where one team, one driver stands out above everybody else, and it takes what seems like forever to knock them off the top of the perch. And then it's just for some new guy to come along and they start a run of their own. It's
Mhm.
crazy.
I was watching a YouTuber who also talks about F1, and he made a point that, like, with the influx of new fans, that many of them came in during 2021. And he
Yep.
said that that was the year that you had this influx of new fans, and it created a paradigm where people think that that's more common than it really is. And I thought, yep, yep. It's like if you really
Yep.
would take time to drill down a little bit, just a little bit into the history of the sport, you'd understand that that's not typical. And it's beautiful that you got to watch that, but like this is not where we're at now. And it's still worth watching. And this is where, and you said this when we were talking offline, that, and I noted it too when I was watching, is how much the broadcast was showing outside of the P1 race,
Right.
everything in the rest of the field. And as I was watching it, I was thinking, thank you, because that's really what I want to see. Like, I don't need
Mm-hmm.
to watch Max just going out
Taking a
and just
Saturday evening
really winning.
drive.
Yeah. Like
Yeah.
that's great. I no way am I denigrating what he's doing. Like I
Right.
understand that that is quite exceptional and amazing, and it's a beautiful moment in the man and machine combining to such a level, and teamwork, all that. But I also know that there are 19 other people on the grid doing some amazing stuff, as well as their teams, and I'd like to be able to witness that too. So that will keep me interested. And so that's what I really hope, that people will eventually realize it's still worth it to spend the time learning and enjoying this sport, because there is still great stuff happening in all the other teams.
Right. Right.
I don't know. How can we help them know that? I guess we would tell our listeners this is why you should share our stuff. So people can hear us saying this, and maybe we can be the thermostat inside of the F1 community instead of the thermometer of taking everybody's temperature and talking about that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
I think that
Sure.
that's how we help the sport and the community thrive. So on that note, let me ask you this, Dick. If I'm a new fan, what should I keep in mind regarding the race?
Well, it is the first race of the year. And clearly we're in a situation, as we've already talked about, Max and Red Bull are still hands down the dominant driver team car combination, right? But the battles behind them are already pretty much on fire. And I think it's going to be a circuit by circuit situation where Ferrari is probably going to be at the pointy end of the grid most of the time.
Hmm.
They're going to be there or thereabouts, as they like to say. But I think that there's going to be a new cast of characters with each successive circuit because, like we discussed, like McLaren, they're going to be good at certain tracks. They always go good at Austria. Why? I don't know, but they seem to always go really, really well there. Okay, so maybe McLaren supplants Ferrari and Austria. I mean, I'm just picking one out, right? But it could
Hmm.
happen with any number of teams. Mercedes, they're not going to stand still, and everybody's going to be developing, including Red Bull. But I think that what you're going to be seeing is all the teams are going to be saying we got to do something about our race pace because we're getting killed.
I agree that
Yeah,
development's going to keep moving. The season's going to be good if you're willing to look at P2 onwards and see them duke it out. Like
yeah,
it'll
and I
it'll be
mean,
great.
yeah, I mean, we might think about like an Aston Martin, for example. They had great one lap pace. They did not have a good race.
Hmm.
But was that just because last year they got it right on Power Dag and this year they didn't get it right? And you go to a track like Jeddah, and all of a sudden Aston Martin's right there. I mean, who knows? I mean, it could very well work that way.
And I like how you point out that it's going to possibly change between each race who we're going to
Mm-hmm.
see in that in those shifting of the spots. Let's move on to looking at the teams, midfield, back of field, front of field. I'm going to
Sure.
lump in Mercedes, McLaren, and Aston into that group because we've already talked about Ferrari. I
Yep.
didn't really change my opinion about the drivers or the car from last week to this week. I think overall, I see this as an extension of their testing and their development efforts. These teams are figuring out, I think, their concepts, if they actually work. And more specifically, I think this weekend showed us that they may be thinking about how it's going to play out over the season, considering the things like the tire dag and what can they extrapolate that moving forward. Because I think there's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
road left between where they see whether or not they have figured out the right way to achieve that incremental or maybe a fairly significant gain in the standings. I especially think that for Mercedes and McLaren, they are teams with leaders, money, and the history of success. Like I kept over the weekend thinking of a statement. I can't remember if it was you or John who said they haven't forgotten how to win.
Right.
And I was like, okay, so they're able to eventually get like they have a runway for where their results can come in. It's just a little bit longer than
Mm-hmm.
maybe others. And I even thought about maybe this is partially because I had binge watched Drive to Survive, not because I wanted to like binge watch, but I knew if I didn't watch it when I did, I wasn't going to get to watch it until a couple months from now. And what I found very interesting was watching the behind the scenes of McLaren last year trying to resolve their issues, and then they
Right.
did it by Silverstone. As I watched it, I thought, yeah, this is showing us exactly what John and Dick had said, which is they didn't forget how to win. They have the infrastructure in place. They're not trying to figure it out. It's actually just an execution issue. And that's what
Yeah.
as I was watching this weekend, I thought, okay, Mercedes and McLaren, they're going to eventually, I think, figure it out. It's just
Right.
it's a timing issue. Aston, though, I think is they're still in that building stage. Like their
Hmm.
success rate is there. But it's not consistent, which is what I think that they need.
A few thoughts. I think you're right on the money. I think I'm a little bit surprised that Mercedes had the cooling issues that they had. I mean, they've been testing at Bahrain the week
Mm,
before. Now they're racing at night. The engines are running too hot, and so what did they do? Well, they had to dial the engine back, so they're not putting out as much power, and it definitely hampered, Lewis and George. There's no question about that. And so that's a little bit of a surprise. The other Mercedes powered teams, I did not hear about them suffering from that. I didn't hear it from, you know, Aston Martin, McLaren, and Williams. So what's the deal there? So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see what happens next week in Jeddah if they find a
yeah.
way to improve the cooling. I mean, that's a big ask in a very short time. So we'll see.
Well, that is fascinating. I hadn't thought about their customers and if they had had the cooling issue until
Right.
you said that. And then I also, when you say that, it makes me wonder how hard did they do the push during testing that this didn't show up, maybe?
Right.
Or is it something that just they dialed it in differently? I don't know.
Yeah.
That's a really good question, Dick,
Yeah.
about the cooling.
The other piece that I thought was really interesting, just kind of going back to Ferrari for a second, Charles
Hmm.
was really hampered by the fact that his brake temperatures
Yes.
across the front were substantially different. One side ran a lot hotter than the other side, and the point that was made was, hey, when we're out running in preseason testing, we're not following four guys. We might follow one guy, but we're not
Mm.
following four guys, and so this problem never turned up until we ran a race. So that suggests that maybe their cooling ducts or whatever just were not enough to keep both brakes at roughly the same temperature. It's an interesting deal. You think about brakes overheating, you would think both of them would be just equally hot. But in this case, they were hot, no question about it. But one was hotter than the other. It's fascinating.
That is fascinating. And then when you say the number of people in front can affect the level. Okay, so we're gonna have to put that for another conversation about brakes in
Yep.
our tech series because now I'm like super curious and could lead us down a rabbit trail, but I'm not going to do that.
All right.
Okay, but I'm writing it down, this question about brakes and heating. Literally writing it down. Yeah, have to be diligent for us, right?
There
Keep
you
us
go.
on track. Okay, so then what about the midfield? I did say this earlier. I think Sauber is the sleeper for the middle of the pack. So
Mhm.
Joe surprised me by how close he was, and Valtteri, yeah, that was, I just cringed for him. But I do think that team has the ability to figure that out, and I'm hoping that was
Yep.
just a one-off. V-carb. If you could see my face, I'm saying this even to the listeners. I'm like, really? Really? Is that the way we need to be? I
Yeah.
couldn't understand it.
Yeah. They probably won't be giving each other Christmas cards, will they? Anyway.
If this is what we're gonna have to deal with all year, I don't know that I ever want them to pan to those two ever again. Like
Right.
I don't want to incentivize that kind of behavior. And I'm not saying one is right or the other. I actually think as the non-racer, I just was like, come on, let's not do
Hmm.
this. You're
Right.
wasting your team's potential here and you're not even up there for the points. So like, why are we doing this right now? It seemed like a power struggle that didn't need to
Hmm.
be happening.
Right.
What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. They were both, I mean, race drivers are race drivers, but Ricardo kind of missed it in qualifying.
Hmm.
Yuki had out qualified him pretty handily. And but towards the end of the race, things had come together for Daniel. And he was driving a very, very good race. In the meantime, Yuki was doing his best to get around the Haas. And so they kind of tripped up over each other. And
Hmm.
hopefully they figure that one out, because, one of the cardinal rules of racing is don't take your teammate out.
So then the next one that has me cringe, like
Huh.
tears in my eyes slightly, like if I'm being over dramatic, like at the emojis that if I could shoot out right now are like the ones where it's like, please stop,
Right.
is Alpine. I
Yeah.
don't understand. What do you think is going on there?
I think that what we're seeing is the chickens coming home to roost from all the management turmoil from last year. And Alpine is paying the price for the chaos that was created by their CEO, Rossi, when all the heads started rolling. And I don't know if you noticed, but their chief aerodynamicist and someone else in a high
Mm-hmm.
ranking technical position, they left just before the start of the Grand Prix season. And it
Mm-hmm.
was just sort of like, yeah, we're out. And so that says to me it is not a bunch of happy campers over there. And so, the car itself is apparently overweight. It doesn't produce a whole lot of downforce compared to the competition, and it produces a lot of drag. So that's a really bad cocktail.
This makes me so sad for them, especially for Pierre Gasly. I really want Pierre to be placed into a car where he can show his ability. And like, I'm almost wondering if he's wondering, why did I leave AlphaTauri,
Right.
V-Carb and set off that chain of events, of that
Yep.
open seat. And that poor kid. This makes me sad. Okay, well, another person that I'm rooting for, largely because he's an American, is Sargent. I'm
Mm-hmm.
always going to be hopeful for him, and I really do want to see him succeed. I really want to be wrong that his days are numbered. I really, 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 really do. But because I realize how hard it is for Americans to get onto that grid. So I don't want him to walk away from that race demoralized. I really want him to remain focused and relentless
Yep.
in his pursuit of showing people that he has what it takes to be on the grid. What are your thoughts?
Well, so Logan went off the track because of a faulty steering wheels. The steering wheels carry an awful lot of the, we'll call it the brains of the car.
Mm-hmm.
And it's unclear to me whether it had an impact on the fly-by-wire system, the brakes. I heard that. I also heard that he had problems with gear changing. But regardless, something in the steering wheel was malfunctioning. And so he goes off the track. He has to get the car turned around and, fiddles around with that, finally gets back to the pits very slowly. They changed the steering wheel. And by that time, of course, the race was over with. So it just became a test session for him, I think, and just getting laps. I mean, it sucks, but it wasn't his fault either.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
and in the meantime, Albon, he had a pretty decent race. It certainly had, did well in qualifying and all that. But, the other side of it is that Logan only missed Q2 by a few hundredths of a second. So, I think, and he didn't crash the car. So
Right.
I think he's making progress. I know that over the wintertime, he spent a lot of time in the simulator at Williams. And I know that he put on something like 5 or 6 kilograms of additional muscle mass, which
Mm-hmm.
has got to help him for his performance during the races. So let's see. I,
Mm-hmm.
I'm a whole lot more optimistic than you are.
Yeah, yeah. And I also think about the fact that I think it was definitely last year. And I'm getting confused because of that binge watching of Drive to Survive, so forgive me for this. But
Mhm.
I feel like it was last year that we read or heard that all the upgrades were being thrown onto Albon's car, largely because of the financials. And
Right.
then DTS noted the same thing, that like a lot of the improvements and development, everything was going towards Albon. So when I watched that, I thought to myself, yeah, it's not as clear as everyone thinks that Sargent's abilities, because it's not like he's being placed into the same car as his teammate, when we always say
Right.
your teammate is your biggest rival, right?
Right.
The second
Right.
side of it is, I feel like it was last week after testing that I read that Williams has this really wonky manufacturing process. Apparently, this shocked Vowles when he came in and was like, "What? This is how you do this?" Like, essentially, like, what is this system? And the way that I understood it is, instead of there being a very interconnected, interdepartmental way of design and manufacturing talking to one another. It was almost like it seemed like independent ways of how each department
They
would
were
just
just
go
in
about it.
silos. Yep.
Right, silos, that's the perfect term. And then all of a sudden it would just be a mad dash to get things built. And he came in and said that's just not gonna fly anymore, especially considering how limited funding
Right.
their pocketbooks aren't as nearly as deep as what they needed to be. So then when I read that and thought, wait a minute, he also said like the wind tunnel and all this other stuff there is dilapidated. I thought, okay, so if they're having to, if this is a, if I'm thinking it more of as a company, if they've been operating like this and they had to choose where we're putting our prime resources, well, it makes sense that they would throw it to Albon because
Right.
he's the tested person. He has
Yep.
the pedigree that they know, but that doesn't put the newbie who you have decided to bring in into the best position to showcase, and or what we've also said in the past is rookies don't get enough time testing and driving.
Oh yeah.
So I guess why I went in that little bit of a rant is because I feel like when I'm reading the social medias, I feel like people are just super picking on Sargent. I'm like,
Yep.
he's not, it's not fair to totally, I'm not saying you don't compare him to Albon, but let's make sure the weights are placed in the right position. If we said you don't want to put 20 pounds on Max to make him
Right.
not perform, well, let's relieve 20 pounds that have been put onto Sargent and see how
Right.
he shows up with everybody else.
Right.
Am I a little kind of too far?
No, no, you haven't gone too far at all. Yeah, I
Okay.
mean, I think it's very fair. And if you're Williams, you understand. I mean, Albon is your number one driver. I mean, he's clearly number one. And budget being budget, if you only got one set of new upgrades and we believe they work, hey man, guess what? Alex is getting it, you know, uh, every time, until Logan proves that he's the equivalent.
Right. And then when you say that he did the work over winter break of putting on the weight and doing the different things, it's again showing it's not complacency. It's
Right,
that if it sounds like if he's given clear, identifiable goals that are achievable, he's not shying away from doing the work. He's not just
right.
kind of there to there, you know?
Right, right.
So that's where like even though I may have originally come out a little bit harder than you, I'm still rooting for the kid. I really want to see
Yep.
him succeed.
Oh,
Okay,
yeah.
there's my rant. Let's move on to the back of the grid. Another person I was rooting for was, as I said, Hulkenberg after the quali. I mean, I was just like, that's amazing.
Right.
That said, after I saw where he landed, I thought, uh, may not work out so well because now you're in the middle of the grid. I hope it works out where you can pop out of there and avoid any of the collisions that seem to always take out the middle of the grid. And it seemed that he just got caught up in that
Hmm.
inevitable bunching up that happens.
Yep.
I just walked away from the race thinking, how I would have loved to have seen what he could have done. You
Right.
know, that was when I thought about him on the Haas side, that side of the Haas garage.
Hmm.
And then Magnuson, I thought he did a great job holding off the V carbs. Like
Yeah.
that was pretty good. I
Oh,
didn't
yeah.
expect that. What
Yeah.
do you think?
Yeah. No, I think that that's fair. I'm a little bit bemused at the gap between Hulkenberg and Magnussen, and maybe this was one race, but I'd have to go back and look. But I'm pretty sure Hulkenberg convincingly won the qualifying competition between the two drivers last year. It seems like it's still going on, which I've never thought of Hulkenberg as just this blisteringly quick guy, but maybe he is. I think it'll be really interesting to see how the season wears on, and I keep pointing back to Jeddah, because I think because of the track surface and because it is such a different track, it's going to be really interesting to see how all the teams react. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if Haas was quick there again. I mean, we'll see, but it wouldn't shock me at all.
Do you think it was a result of the car, the strategy, or racecraft that got Hulkenberg where he got?
It's probably a little bit a little bit of everything, but I would say that they've probably taken a bit of a step with the car. They had the advantage, like everybody else, of a whole bunch of practice at Bahrain. So given the limited resources of Haas, maybe it was sort of like, yeah, we really understand what we need for Bahrain, which is a different track. You already said, hey, it's like the high deck track of the year. But we also saw this a little bit last year where suddenly at certain tracks, all of a sudden the Haas was looking good. And then of course
Mm,
race came and they faded, right? And
that's
so
true.
yeah. And so I think there's a little bit of a knock-on effect from last year, probably. But let's face it, I mean, Hulkenberg and Magnussen are not exactly kids. I mean, they know how this game is played. So they're
Mhm.
both very, very good drivers.
That's a good point about bringing in their longevity as
Yep.
drivers. The very reasons I think that Haas brought them in. This shows
Yep.
that. Is there any notable performances in your mind from this race?
Yeah, a couple of things or comments. One, Carlos Sainz is clearly on fire. He's got a lot to prove. I think if I get inside Carlos's head, yes, he's driving for a seat in 2025, no question about it. But at the same time, he's driving this year to show Ferrari, hey, you know what? You guys made a mistake. And so got a little bit of a chip on the shoulder, I'm gonna guess, which he's got to be careful, like we talked about. It's kind of that balancing act. Like you still got to be a good teammate, and yet you kind of need to beat your teammate. So I kind of hope that continues. It'll be really interesting to see how Charles handles it, especially if Carlos keeps getting the better of him. We'll see. I was also a little bit surprised that George handled Lewis like he did. But I come to find out after the race that Mercedes did have some problems of their own. We kind of talked about this, one of them already, which was just the cooling issues. The cars had to be dialed back on horsepower to produce less heat so that they could make it to the finish. So there was that. But that was what was true for Lewis was also true for George. But what wasn't coming out until after the race is that Lewis was racing with a broken seat. Now, how you get a broken seat, knowing how they make those things and how they're subjected to various tests and all that kind of stuff, that's beyond me. So, given that he had a broken seat and was probably moving around in the car, whether it was on the brakes, going through corners, accelerating, whatever, poor old Lewis was probably hanging on for dear life between the steering wheel and the seatbelt harnesses, keeping him in because that seat was moving around underneath him. So, props to him. I don't know how he did it. So I thought that was really interesting, though.
I mean, that's remarkable to me that that seat was broken. Like, especially
Mm-hmm.
considering they didn't transport it, right? Since
Right.
testing week. It's just
Right.
been staying in the same garage.
Yep.
So, yeah, that's
Only thing
I
I can
find that.
figure is that it just didn't cure correctly for whatever
Mhm.
reason. And it was just it was a faulty build to begin with, and it just broke.
Well, in that case, I'm glad they figured it out now,
Yep.
not later, and that it didn't create any kind of significant harm to him in
Yeah.
any way that we know of, at
Yeah.
least. Hopefully, with when you say he's holding on for dear life, just knowing what that the physical told us a good seat would take, you got to wonder
Mm-hmm.
if he's feeling it now from just the sheer will of wanting to make sure he completed the race. Did you realize your favorite driver, the one that you're a fanboy for, Fernando,
Yeah.
is the only driver who raced in Bahrain 20 years ago that remains on the grid when the track first opened? Did you know that?
I did not know that, but I mean, he's going to start setting records like that, I mean, because he's been around for so long. One of these days he'll come out and he'll have a flowing white beard and he'll be with a cane or a walker and they'll have to like winch him into the car. And then all of a sudden he'll still be, right on pace with everybody else. I'm kind of thinking that may be the way it goes down.
When you started saying flowing my beard, my first impression was Santa Claus. And
Right.
I was like,
Right.
but now as you say it, as you kept going, I went, well, it's kind of like Gandalf. Okay,
Yeah.
I can totally take Gandalf. That's fun. That works for me.
That's
And
hilarious.
then I also read when it comes to the track that the track is the highest deg that we'll see all year, which based off of what you observe, which now I'm going to go back and
Yep.
rewatch the race to see if I can catch those clips, makes sense with these rocks
Yep.
that are inside there.
Yep. Yeah. It just looks incredibly abrasive. So if that's the higher, I'll put it to you this way: if that track isn't the highest tire deg track on the season, I want to know what is, because that looks. I mean, it looks like they're driving on sandpaper, man.
And now for John's notes on the race. Question. Quali. What did you see that excited you for the Grand Prix? John's answer. Close racing and many passes. Technical excellence by most of the drivers. This is a good group of drivers who deserve to be recognized as such throughout the field. Question. Who caught your eye? Driver, team? John's answer. Carlos Sainz. This shows how to take a really good driver and turn him into a great driver. Put him in a position where he has nothing to lose. Expect more from him. Question. What can we glean about ongoing development across the grid? John's answer. Everyone but Alpine made progress, but Red Bull and Max in particular made more, and are going to be pretty unassailable for the Drivers' Championship. The Manufacturers' Championship is less certain at this point and will depend on Perez and his consistency. Question. What's your favorite aspect of this race? John's answer. They are back racing and maybe the off-track drama will go away. Question. What data does this race provide us about the championship, driver, or constructor? John's answer. Other than Max and Carlos, it is too early to be able to say much. Question. If I'm a new fan, what should I keep in mind regarding this race? John's answer. One race does not a season make. Watch for the development as the season progresses. Question. How are the rookies doing? John's answer. Technically, there are no rookies now. Piastri looks like he's been driving for years in F1. Okay, friends, what did you think of our conversation? Do you agree with Dick? Is this just part 2 of 2023? What about my thoughts of Sauber being a midfield sleeper? And John's thoughts about Oscar Piastri? Send us your feedback, things you're seeing out in the media, your suggestion of topics you think the guys and I should cover via email. Sabrina at 2guysagirlandf1.com. We need your help to increase our 2 Guys, a Girl, and F1 community. Follow and rate us on your favorite podcast apps and share our episodes. With that, let me say, we'll keep talking and you can keep listening in because we're just 2 guys, a girl, and F1. For John, Dick, and me, Sabrina, thanks for listening.